In 1984, the world looked at Ethiopia and thought it was seeing the full meaning of famine. Cameras arrived in the north and carried devastation into living rooms across the Western world. The images were unbearable. Children with swollen bellies, mothers holding bodies so weak they could no longer cry. Dust, silence, the slow violence of hunger made visible. Those broadcasts became one of the defining humanitarian visions of the 20th century, a symbol so powerful it seemed to explain everything. But it did not explain everything. Because while those cameras were fixed on death in the north, far to the south, under the same brutal sky, in the same season of drought, among people facing the same failed rains and the same hard earth, something astonishing was happening. Almost no one was starving. And the reason was not foreign aid. It was not emergency intervention. It was not luck, and it was not coincidence. It was a plant, a single crop, grown for thousands of years in the highland gardens of southern Ethiopia. A crop so resilient, so productive, and so deeply woven into human survival that it quietly did what entire relief systems could not do. It prevented famine before famine could begin. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Forgotten Earthworks, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes the future of food can only come from laboratories, markets, and industrial-scale farming. Because some of the most important answers on Earth were never lost. They were simply ignored. The plant is called enset, and it may be the most important crop most of the world has never heard of. At first glance, it looks almost familiar. It rises taller than a person, with broad green leaves that spread like giant paddles and a thick central stalk that gives it the silhouette of a banana tree. It even produces banana-like fruits. But those fruits are useless as food, packed with hard black seeds no one eats. The true value of enset is hidden where drought cannot easily touch it, inside the swollen base of the plant and beneath the ground itself, where energy is stored in silence. That hidden architecture is the first clue to its power. Around 20 million Ethiopians rely on enset as a staple. They have relied on it for longer than many of the world's great monuments have stood. In the southwestern highlands, across elevations ranging from roughly 1,200 to 3,100 meters, entire communities built their food systems around it. Sidama, Guraj, Wolaita, Hadia, and many more. For them, enset was never just another crop in a field. It was infrastructure, memory, insurance, stability made biological. And over time, they did not merely cultivate it, they shaped it. This is what makes the story so extraordinary. Enset was refined through countless generations of intimate human attention. Families selected different plants for different soils, different altitudes, different household needs, different textures, different timings. In the enset growing regions, there are more than 1,500 recorded names for distinct varieties, not abstract categories, not vague folk labels, but living clones with specific identities and specific histories. Each name carries knowledge. Each variety preserves a decision made long ago by someone who understood exactly what survival required. Think about what that means. This was not accidental farming. This was a civilization of precision. Some varieties were chosen because they matured a certain way, some because they handled drought, some because they processed more easily, some because they produced better food. A name could describe softness, strength, common use, or local reputation. What looks to outsiders like one plant was, in reality, an entire cultural archive, a library written in roots, leaves, stems, labor, and inheritance. And once you understand that, you begin to see why enset is so difficult to compare with ordinary crops. Because ordinary crops ask for a season, Enset asks for patience. It does not rush toward harvest the way wheat or barley does. It does not gamble everything on one short window of rain. It does not rise, seed, dry, and die in a single cycle. Enset can remain in the ground for years, growing steadily, storing value over time. A household does not plant it all at once and pray for one successful harvest. A household keeps enset in many stages of growth at the same time. Young plants, maturing plants, plants nearing readiness, a living reserve distributed across time itself. That changes everything. When a grain system fails, it fails all at once. When rains miss the season, when heat strikes at the wrong moment, when pests arrive at flowering, the loss is immediate and often total. A failed season means empty granaries, desperate sales, livestock slaughter, migration, hunger. But enset does not live by that logic. It waits, it stands, it stores. It can be harvested when needed and left alone when not. It behaves less like a field crop than like a buried savings account, one that deepens with time and remains accessible in emergency. This is why communities that depend on it have long understood it in the simplest possible terms. It is the tree against hunger. That phrase is not poetic exaggeration. It is a practical definition. Studies comparing Ethiopia's major crops have found enset to be staggeringly productive, delivering exceptional yield per hectare and immense food value from a relatively small amount of land. A mature plant can provide enormous edible mass, and because farms maintain plants of different ages, food security does not depend on one moment of success. Something is always on the way. Something is always growing. Something can always be taken when the household needs it most. But here is where the story turns. Raw enset is not, by itself, the miracle. The miracle is what people learn to do with it. When enset is harvested, the edible tissues are scraped from the pseudostem, and the underground corm is processed into a mash. That mash is wrapped in enset leaves, placed into pits dug into the earth, and left to ferment. Then invisible life takes over. Lactic acid bacteria and yeasts begin transforming the plant. Starches shift. Flavor develops. Digestibility improves. Preservation becomes possible. Time itself becomes part of the recipe. What emerges is kocho, a dense, slightly sour fermented bread that can sustain families for astonishing lengths of time. Alongside it come other foods, including bulla, a refined starchy product, and amicho, the boiled corm eaten like a root crop. But the deepest power here is not taste, though taste matters. It is not nutrition, though nutrition matters too. The deepest power is duration. Fermentation turns harvest into continuity. A properly maintained pit can preserve food for years. Some households have kept fermentation systems active across generations, adding new material, drawing down old reserves, managing a living reserve underground. This is not a pantry in the modern sense. It is not a shelf lined with industrial packages. It is a biological vault, breathing quietly beneath the soil, maintained by skill, memory, and repetition. And that skill is not generic. It is local, inherited, embodied. Different communities maintain different starter cultures. Different regions use different methods. The microbial life that begins fermentation may be passed between families like an heirloom. Techniques are taught hand to hand, often from older women to younger ones, not in textbooks, but in practice. The texture of the mash, the timing of the pit, the handling of the leaves, the judgment of readiness, all of it lives in the body before it lives in words. That matters because this is where most outsiders fail to understand enset. They see a plant. What they should see is a knowledge system. And once you see that, The events of 1984 look different, because the Great Famine that shocked the world did not strike all Ethiopian communities equally. In the north, where farming systems leaned heavily on cereal crops like teff, wheat, and barley, drought shattered the season. The crops depended on timing. Timing failed, and hunger followed. But in the enset growing south, the same sky could withhold rain, and households could still survive. Their fields were not just fields. Their gardens were staggered reserves. Their fermentation pits were delayed harvests from years before. Their resilience had already been planted. Imagine the contrast. In one part of the country, airplanes, convoys, headlines, emergency campaigns. In another, people drawing food from a system their grandparents had already prepared. That should have changed global agricultural thinking forever. It did not. And that may be one of the most revealing failures in the modern history of food. Because once researchers began looking closely, a disturbing pattern became clear. Development institutions had spent decades prioritizing cereal crops, annual grains that could be measured, marketed, sold, exported, and folded neatly into the logic of the global commodity system. Wheat, rice, maize. These crops fit the machinery of modern agricultural science. They could be tested in plots, standardized in programs, distributed in packages, counted in harvests, and moved through supply chains. Enset did not fit. It could not be reduced to a simple annual output. It required years of cultivation, local expertise, fermentation knowledge, social labor, and cultural continuity. It was not just planted and harvested. It was managed, interpreted, timed, processed, and preserved through relationships. You could not mail it as a miracle solution in an envelope. You could not separate the crop from the people who knew it. And so the institutions built to solve hunger often looked straight past one of the most powerful anti-famine systems on Earth. Not because it was weak, because it was inconvenient to the model. This is the blind spot at the heart of the story. The world became obsessed with scalable, tradable, measurable crops. Anything that moved outside that framework was treated as marginal, backward, local, or too complex to matter. But complexity was exactly what gave enset its strength. It was resilient because it was embedded. It endured because it belonged to a whole civilization of use. So while the Green Revolution transformed vast parts of the planet through improved cereals, irrigation, fertilizer, and export-oriented systems, enset remained largely invisible. No great global institution was built around it. No international campaign carried it across continents. No major development mythology elevated it into a symbol of the future. And yet, in the place where it mattered most, it kept doing the one thing that mattered above all. It kept people alive. Now the irony is becoming impossible to ignore. Researchers studying enset in recent years have suggested that its potential range is far larger than the area where it is currently grown. Climate modeling and agricultural analysis indicate that enset cultivation could, under the right conditions and with the right knowledge transfer, support tens of millions more people across East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, regions facing climate pressure, food insecurity, and deep vulnerability to the collapse of seasonal reliability may already contain environments where this plant could thrive. That possibility is staggering. But the obstacle is not simply seeds, land, or rainfall. The obstacle is transmission. Because enset does not travel the way wheat traveled. You cannot just scatter it and walk away. The plant must be understood. The fermentation must be learned. The culture around it must be carried, adapted, respected. The processing is labor-intensive. The timing is taught. The expertise lives in communities, not in product brochures. This is why the current efforts to study and preserve enset matter so much. Researchers, botanists, Ethiopian institutions, and conservation partners are not merely investigating an unusual crop. They are trying to safeguard a shrinking world of practical intelligence before it erodes under the pressure of migration, monoculture, and neglect. As younger generations move toward cities and industrial food systems spread, some of the old varieties are disappearing. Names vanish. Skills weaken. Local distinctions collapse. A living archive contracts. And that should concern all of us, because the climate that produced the modern grain system is changing. The assumptions that made annual monocultures seem inevitable are breaking apart. Rainfall is less predictable. Heat arrives harder. Seasons behave strangely. Yield shocks are no longer rare warnings from the future. They are the shape of the present arriving early. Enset was not built for perfect stability. It was built for uncertainty. It was shaped over thousands of years by people who understood delayed rains, partial failures, difficult intervals, and the need for food systems that do not collapse because one season goes wrong. In a world moving toward volatility, that is not primitive. That is advanced. In a century defined by climate disruption, that is not an agricultural curiosity. That is strategic intelligence stored in a plant. So perhaps the real lesson here is larger than enset itself. Perhaps the lesson is that resilience does not always look modern. It does not always come wrapped in patented genetics, satellite dashboards, or export forecasts. Sometimes it looks like a highland garden. Sometimes it smells like fermentation in a pit beneath the earth. Sometimes it survives because families kept practicing something the global system never thought important enough to count. And what else have we failed to count? How many food traditions were dismissed because they were too local? How many climate answers were ignored because they were too old? How many systems of survival were written off simply because they did not produce profit in the right format? Enset forces those questions into the open. It tells us that food sovereignty is not an abstraction. It is a material reality. It is the ability of communities to feed themselves from their own ground, using knowledge adapted to their own conditions, without waiting for fragile international supply chains to function on time. It tells us that biodiversity is not just beauty. It is insurance. It tells us that memory is not sentimental. It is infrastructure. And it tells us something else, something harder. The future may depend less on inventing entirely new systems than on finally recognizing the genius of those that were already here. The families of southern Ethiopia did not need to invent resilience in 1984. They inherited it. They tended it. They fermented it. They named it 1,500 different ways. They passed it from hand to hand until it became stronger than drought, stronger than neglect, stronger even than global indifference. That is what the cameras missed. Not just a plant, but a civilization of foresight. So the question is no longer whether enset matters. It already proved that it does. The question is whether the rest of the world is finally ready to learn from what highland communities understood long before modern development agencies arrived with clipboards and theories. Because enset did not fail to save the world. The world failed to notice enset. If this story changed how you think about food, climate, and survival, subscribe to Forgotten Earthworks. Like this video, share it with someone who still believes resilience only comes from the top down. Every view helps keep this knowledge in the room. Every share pushes back against erasure, and every time a forgotten system is remembered, the future becomes a little less fragile. Somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, beneath green leaves and dark soil, food is still waiting in silence. Not as a relic, as an answer.